As the year began, the United States was surmounting the last barriers to full reconversion. We were financially an island apart from the world. Our national income was predicted to exceed $200 billion. Never before had the nation known such freedom from want. But in this realm of abundance, we reigned alone. Across the vast expanses of the globe, there were famine, national ruin, pestilence, and moral disintegration. 4 horsemen driving civilization to the brink of an abyss. Without help, recovery might never be achieved. In the background was the growing struggle between 2 great powers to shape the post-war world. Looking toward Europe from Moscow, Soviet Russia was expansively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war, with misery and chaos as allies. On orders from the Kremlin, Russia had launched one of history's most drastic political, moral, and economic wars, a Cold War. The United States was obliged to help Europe safeguard its traditional freedoms and the independence of its nations. Gone was the spirit of wartime unity that reached its peak on that historic afternoon in April '45 at the Elbe River in Germany. Here, 2 worlds actually met, but this coalition was to be torn asunder. 2 years later, European capitals still suffering from the shooting war were battlegrounds for totalitarian aggression. Internal recovery was sabotaged through the creation of disaster and strife to the point of civil war. Russia's expansionism timetable called for dividing Europe in 2, swallowing first one half, then the other. Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, menace to the security and institutions of democratic government. What was America's foreign policy in January 1947? Our Secretary of State as the year began was James F. Byrnes, who had used tactics of patient persuasion. At Stuttgart, Germany, Byrnes had made one of his strongest declarations of policy when he said, "After the First World War, America thought it could stay out of Europe's wars. That did not keep us from being forced into a Second World War. We will not again make that mistake. We intend to continue our interest in the affairs of Europe and of the world." But Russia still held firm to her belief that a depression in America would keep us out of Europe, and that confusion and hunger would win for communism. Yet America already was flashing a beacon of hope as it turned from appeasement to the diplomatic offensive. The new policy was acknowledged to have had its beginning following Byrnes's resignation and the acceptance of his office by General George C. Marshall. From the moment he took over, Marshall was to be instrumental in the broadest projection of U.S. foreign policy since the American colonies broke away from the Crown. It may be said that the impetus came from London, number 10 Downing Street. It was February 1947 in a tight little island where the hardships of Europe's worst winter further hampered recovery. In this grave hour, could Britain continue to support occupation forces in Greece and maintain the security of Turkey? Britain had poured over $250 million into Greece since liberation. The issues were clear. Greece, only Balkan country still outside the Iron Curtain, key to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Dardanelles, it had to be kept free. If an already weakened Greece were to fall to Russia, Turkey would be outflanked. This was the problem that brought Britain to its momentous decision. On the 27th day of February, a note was brought from London to Washington, informing our government that Britain was too poor to continue her aid to Greece and Turkey. America had been thrust into a role of international responsibility. A new and vigorous policy for waging the peace was imperative. It came just as Secretary Marshall was preparing for his mission to Moscow. In the White House, President Truman and his advisors accepted the challenge. Before a joint session of Congress on March 12th, Mr. Truman outlined his doctrine for halting further communist encroachment. As a start, he recommended funds with which to bolster Greece and Turkey.
I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for the period ending June 30th, 1948.
But the opening of the European front for deployment of America's economic and moral forces was but one maneuver. Already the State Department was planning our policy of containing communism wherever it showed itself outside the Soviet Union. Under Mr. Marshall, the State Department followed the pattern of a military high command. George F. Kennan headed the policy planning staff. A student of world communism, Mr. Kennan had been identified as the author of a significant article, the first definite indication of a new U.S. foreign policy. A long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This declaration meant that Russia must be kept within boundaries already about equal to the circumference of the globe. From the Arctic, around the Pacific coast, North China and the Middle East to Western Europe, pressure points existed in the new containment offensive. Europe, broken and vulnerable to Soviet power, became the first front in democracy's counterattack. In June, Secretary Marshall announced a plan to help Europe rebuild its shattered economy. He urged the nations to get together on their needs, to draw up their own blueprint for survival, which could then be implemented by our government. In Paris, 16 Western nations began to draft their program. Russia and the nations of Eastern Europe within her orbit refused to join and boycotted the Marshall Plan. Work on the blueprint for rebuilding Europe's shattered economy continued on into September. Meanwhile, before the United Nations General Assembly, the world witnessed another forceful demonstration of the new American policy. There was profound concern for the survival of UN itself, as the Russian veto bogged down major issues. To this great world arena came our Secretary of State, bluntly to speak out against the Soviet Union for a course which he implied was blocking peace and which ultimately would wreck the UN. Russia's reply came from Deputy Foreign Minister Vichinsky. He charged the American government with plotting war and accused many prominent Americans of warmongering.
General Electric, Standard Oil,
This was the vilification plan as opposed to the Marshall Plan. The shrill attacks on American imperialism were to be re-echoed wherever the Politburo could penetrate. But 6 days later in Paris, the delegates of the Western European nations finally affixed their signatures to a significant document. The Marshall Plan had received the green light. The magnitude of America's future role was given graphic expression by a single sentence in the British press. Never before has one nation carried a greater responsibility for the fate of others in time of peace. Reduced to its simplest form, the bulky Paris report meant that America must again send ammunition overseas. Ammunition for peace in the form of food, machinery, skills, and dollars. Figures quoted reached $17 billion. Americans heard that until this long-range plan goes into action, stopgap aid was needed. Austria, Italy, and France were declared to be in desperate straits by Secretary Marshall.
In order to meet this emergency, I recommend that you give immediate and urgent consideration to a bill authorizing the appropriation of sufficient funds to provide the supplies necessary to permit the people of these countries to continue to eat, to work, and to survive the winter.
Before Christmas, more than $500 million were made available, and the President affixed his signature to an interim aid authorization bill. As the year drew to a close, the first results were being felt. French communists compelled to end their strikes, sabotage, and violence. The Red Retreat duplicated in Italy. Democracy maintaining the offensive in the Cold War, and the European recovery program bolstered each time a communist uprising was crushed. Victories which are the inspiration for a new year of struggle for the right in Europe, the right to live as a free people. Not even the collapse of the Big Four meeting on peace treaties for Germany and Austria could minimize the gains that had been made. At this meeting, there was complete deadlock on all major issues, including Germany's economic future and reparations. But the battle of words had ended without democracy giving ground. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov heard Secretary Marshall blame Russia for holding back world recovery. The split between two world statesmen was reflected in their respective uneasy capitals. For here was more than merely a clash of power politics. It was a conflict of ideals, of faith, of the very way of life.
In America, we know our opinions and actions are motivated by national conscience, inherited love for freedom's ways, symbolized this very year by two shrines on wheels, the Friendship Train, spontaneous expression of goodwill, and the Freedom Train, carrying the cherished original documents of American history. Across thousands of miles of tracks, into 300 American communities, an ideal conceived in the name of good citizenship. Here, then, is our propaganda. We who seek no reparations, no booty, no territories. Here are our weapons. We who cherish the democratic system and free enterprise, wrung from the bitter struggle of centuries. Our heritage in these sacred declarations of principles is again our impetus for extending the hand of charity and support to those far from American shores. In the faded writing of these documents are the meaning and purpose of this government's everlasting interest in the affairs of others. For wherever guarantees of justice and equality are in jeopardy, there we find threatened the rights of all free men. Ours is a sacred trust, but we do not seek to stand alone. Even for Russia, there is an open door through respect of the sovereignty of the individual. "1948 holds grim forebodings, but our country remains strong, united, secure in the belief that the heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future." Yes, one nation, 143 million Americans living by the charters handed down by righteous men. Power and riches enough to crush a universe, yet a nation that would endure with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. In this spirit, America faces the future as the clock of history reaches the first hour of a new year.